The tray of punishment. The steel tray slid under the cell door. On it sat a lump of something brown, a slice of stale bread, and a cup of water. The inmate looked down, his stomach turning, not because he wasn't hungry, but because he knew exactly what this was. They called it the loaf. A block of mashed beans, flour, powdered eggs, and vegetables baked into a brick. Cold. Nearly impossible to swallow. At Rikers, ADX, and Pelican Bay, this wasn't just food. It was a weapon. A form of punishment. A way to break men without ever laying a hand on them. Some prisoners would rather starve than eat it. Others choked it down, day after day, until their bodies and minds began to crumble. But here's the question. How did food, something meant to keep you alive, become one of the most feared punishments inside America's toughest prisons? The Rikers tray. At New York's infamous Rikers Island, food was supposed to be a break from the violence. But for many inmates, it was just another fight to survive. Breakfast might be watery oatmeal. Lunch, mystery meat sandwiches with soggy bread. Dinner, beans, rice, or chicken that sometimes smelled like it had gone bad. The less extreme part? Some men laughed it off. They traded trays, hustled for extra packets of ketchup, or begged guards for seconds just to make the meal edible. But the extreme came when disciplined meals were handed out. If a guard said you disrespected them, you might be put on the loaf. 3 times a day. No variety. No flavor. Just dry punishment. One inmate said, after 3 days your stomach knots up. After a week, you don't even feel human anymore. And just when the men thought it couldn't get worse, rats sometimes ran across the dining hall floors, scavenging for scraps. The chapter closes with an inmate pushing away his tray in disgust, whispering to himself, "I'd rather fight hunger than eat this poison." ADX Florence, the menu of isolation. If Rikers was bad, ADX Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies, was worse. Here, food wasn't just punishment. It was control. Inmates spent 23 hours a day in their cells. Meals came on trays slid through a slot in the steel door. No dining hall. No talking. Just silence. The less extreme? On normal days, the food looked like cafeteria meals, frozen burritos, processed chicken patties, instant potatoes. Barely warm by the time it reached the cell. But the extreme came fast. If you broke the rules, you got nutraloaf. A nutrition brick made of powdered vegetables, flour, and beans. No seasoning. No taste. Just calories to keep you alive. One prisoner wrote, "You don't chew it. You just swallow and pray it doesn't come back up." Some men lost 20, even 30 pounds while on food punishment. Others snapped under the monotony, banging their heads against the wall just to feel something different. This chapter ends with a tray sliding under the door, the inmates staring at the brick of food like it was a death sentence. Pelican Bay. Hunger as discipline. Pelican Bay in California was built for one thing: control. And food was part of that system. The less extreme? Normal meals were bland: beans, rice, boiled vegetables. No salt. No flavor. But at least it kept men going. The extreme? If you disobeyed, meals could be stripped down to almost nothing. Just bread and water. Or the dreaded loaf. Some prisoners described feeling dizzy after a few days, their hands shaking, their bodies weak. Others turned violent. Fights broke out in the chow hall over stolen bread or an extra carton of milk. The food scarcity created a new battlefield inside the prison. The chapter closes with a violent clash in the dining hall. Trays flying, men fighting, guards rushing in with pepper spray. All of it started because one man cut in line for an extra piece of bread. Broken by the menu. Across these prisons, Rikers, ADX, and Pelican Bay, the story was the same. Food wasn't just about nutrition. It was about power. Deny it and you controlled the body. Twist it and you controlled the mind. The less extreme side? Some inmates managed to adapt, using salt from Commissary, crushing ramen noodles, even mixing Kool-Aid to flavor rotten meat. They built small recipes in their cells just to trick their brains into eating. But the extreme side was darker. Inmates collapsed from weakness. Some were hospitalized. A few even tried to take their own lives rather than face another day of punishment by food. The chapter ends with a haunting image, an untouched tray sitting on the floor, the inmate curled in the corner, whispering, "They're breaking me from the inside." The taste of desperation. In prison, meals weren't just food. They were currency. At Rikers, men would trade a slice of bread for a cigarette, or a packet of sugar for protection. The less extreme part was almost comical, prisoners turning the dining hall into a kind of underground market. But desperation grew darker. When the trays ran thin, some men risked violence for extra portions. Guards turned a blind eye, knowing the food itself was fueling the chaos. The extreme moment came one night when an inmate, denied his bread, lunged across the table, stabbing another with a plastic fork. All of it, for a piece of stale cornbread. The scene left blood on the floor, and the message was clear. In prison, food meant survival. ADX, silent hunger. In the Supermax of Colorado, silence ruled the corridors. But behind the heavy steel doors, hunger screamed louder than words. The less extreme? Men in ADX became creative. They soaked ramen in lukewarm sink water, crushed chips to make crumbs, and saved coffee packs for a small sense of comfort. But the extreme was unavoidable. Some prisoners, cut off from commissary, punished with bland meals, would smear their trays across the wall, refusing to eat. Guards would just slide in another loaf the next day. The punishment never stopped. One man, after weeks on nutraloaf, was found chewing the corner of his mattress, his body trembling from weakness. This chapter ends with a chilling silence, the sound of a tray sliding away untouched, the man inside whispering, "I'm disappearing." Pelican Bay's war for milk. At California's Pelican Bay, even milk cartons sparked conflict. The less extreme? Some men tried to keep peace. They shared food, formed small groups to divide what little they had. A fragile truce existed in the chow hall. But that truce shattered one morning when two gangs clashed over cartons of milk. A simple breakfast turned into a riot. Trays flew, fists swung, and guards stormed in with batons. The extreme came when one inmate slammed another onto the steel table, knocking him unconscious. The fight was over milk, just milk. The chapter closes with the echo of boots on the concrete floor, guards dragging men out, and the untouched trays left behind. Rikers, rotten meat. In New York, rumors spread fast about the kitchen. Some inmates swore the meat came from old supplies, unfit for human consumption. The less extreme? On good days, men laughed about it. They joked about Mystery Meat Mondays, making fun of the food to ease the disgust. But then came the extreme. A batch of spoiled chicken was served. Dozens of inmates doubled over with cramps, vomiting into buckets. The infirmary overflowed, guards shouting at men to keep still while others collapsed. One prisoner said, "It wasn't just bad food. It was poison." The chapter ends with sirens blaring inside Rikers, medical teams rushing in, and trays of rotten meat scattered across the floor. ADX, hunger strikes. Food had become more than punishment, it was protest. The less extreme? Inmates wrote letters, begging for better food. Some even filed lawsuits from inside their cells. Most requests were ignored. The extreme response? Hunger strikes. Men refused to eat, tray after tray piling up outside their doors. Guards watched, recording how many meals were skipped. After 3 days, the bodies weakened. After a week, men collapsed. But the administration didn't bend. Instead, force-feeding tubes were prepared. Men were strapped to chairs, liquid pumped into their stomachs against their will. This chapter ends with a haunting image, a prisoner strapped down, eyes empty, as a feeding tube is forced through his nose. Pelican Bay, the Loaf legacy. At Pelican Bay, the Loaf had become legendary. Old-timers warned new arrivals, "Step out of line, and you'll be eating bricks." The less extreme? Some tried to make the best of it. They soaked the loaf in water, tried to mash it into something edible. A few even toasted bits of it on the radiator to soften the taste. But the extreme? After days on loaf meals, one inmate's body gave out. He fainted in the yard, his face hitting the concrete. Blood poured from his nose as guards rushed in. For the men watching, it was a lesson. The menu wasn't feeding them, it was breaking them. The chapter closes with the haunting sound of the chow hall doors slamming shut, echoing across the prison. The Commissary Kings. Inside Rikers, the commissary was a lifeline. Instant noodles, chips, candy bars, small luxuries that turned bland trays into meals. The less extreme? Some men built friendships over food trades, sharing ramen soups or creating prison pizzas with crackers, sauce, and cheese from commissary bags. For a moment, the misery of the menu faded. But the extreme side was brutal. Commissary turned into a war zone. Stronger inmates extorted weaker ones, demanding food credits. Refuse, and you might be jumped in the showers. One night, an inmate was dragged into his cell corner and beaten until his commissary slips fell from his pocket. All of it, for 2 packs of noodles. The chapter ends with guards finding the man unconscious, ramen packets scattered on the floor. The smell of hunger. At ADX Florence, even the smell of food was punishment. The less extreme? Prisoners described the aroma of warm bread or roasted meat drifting down the hallways, reminding them of what they couldn't have. It was torture by memory. But the extreme? Some men were deliberately starved before being moved to loaf punishment. For 24 hours, they were given only water. When the loaf finally arrived, their bodies were so weak they tore at it like animals. One guard admitted, "We used food as leverage. Hunger makes men obey." The chapter closes with the chilling sound of teeth crunching into a cold, flavorless brick of loaf, echoing down the steel corridor. Pelican Bay, the spread. Inmates at Pelican Bay created something legendary, the spread. A communal meal built from commissary, ramen, tuna, chips, even candy, mixed together in trash bags and served in bowls cut from milk cartons. The less extreme? For some men, this was a rare moment of joy. They laughed, shared stories, and for one night felt human again. But the extreme struck when guards raided the cell block mid-meal. They overturned spreads, trashed commissary, and threw men into segregation. One inmate screamed as his only stash of food, saved for months, was stomped into the ground. The chapter ends with the sight of smashed ramen and tuna smeared across the concrete floor, while the men sat in silence, defeated. Rikers, food fights. Food fights weren't a joke inside Rikers. The less extreme? Some inmates hurled trays for fun, splattering beans and rice against the walls, laughing like kids in a cafeteria. But things turned violent fast. In one incident, trays turned into weapons. Men launched metal spoons, swinging hard plastic trays like shields. The chow hall turned into a battlefield. The extreme moment came when a guard was struck in the face with a tray corner, blood running down his cheek. The entire hall was locked down. The chapter ends with sirens blaring, inmates shoved against the walls, beans dripping from the ceiling. ADX, the Starvation games. In the Supermax, some prisoners played a deadly game with food, refusing to eat until they collapsed. The less extreme? They traded stories through the walls about how long they could last, testing their limits against hunger. But one man pushed too far. After 2 weeks of refusing trays, he collapsed, his body skeletal, his lips cracked and bleeding. Guards carried him out on a stretcher, his eyes rolling back. For the men in nearby cells, the silence after was worse than the screams. The chapter ends with the sound of the slot closing, another untouched tray sliding away. Pelican Bay, bread and blood. Bread was survival. And at Pelican Bay, men would fight for it. The less extreme? Some hoarded bread rolls in their mattresses, saving them for late-night hunger. Others toasted them against hot pipes to soften the crust. But one night, 2 inmates clashed over stolen bread. A fist fight escalated into a stabbing. Guards found one man slumped over, his blood dripping onto the bread roll that caused it all. The chapter closes with the chilling image of that roll, soaked red, left untouched on the floor. Rikers, the rotten apple. New York City prided itself on being a global capital. But inside Rikers, the food told another story. The less extreme? On rare days, inmates got apples or oranges. For a moment, it felt like dignity. But one shipment came spoiled. Apples bruised black, oranges rotten with mold. Prisoners shouted in protest, banging their trays, refusing to eat. The extreme came when guards responded with pepper spray, filling the chow hall with choking gas. Men coughed, eyes burning, as rotten fruit rolled across the floor. The chapter ends with smoke lingering in the air, apples crushed under heavy boots. The smear. Food wasn't always eaten. Sometimes, it was used as a weapon of defiance. The less extreme? Some men smeared sauce or beans on the walls, leaving messages for guards, angry words, crude drawings, silent rebellion. But the extreme was darker. Inmates smeared rotten food across their own bodies, shouting through the doors. Guards in hazmat suits stormed in, dragging them to showers, the stench filling the block. One officer said, the food wasn't keeping them alive, it was driving them insane. The chapter closes with the clang of steel doors, the smell of rot hanging in the air. Pelican Bay, the cold tray. The men called it the cold tray. Food served icy, as if it had just come from a freezer. The less extreme? Some swallowed it quickly, trying not to taste it, washing it down with tap water that smelled of rust. Others heated trays on radiator pipes, desperate for warmth. But the extreme came when one prisoner bit into half-frozen beans, cracked a tooth, and spat blood onto the floor. His screams echoed through the chow hall while guards shrugged. The chapter ends with that tooth lying in a puddle of cold beans. Rikers, the forgotten meal. At Rikers, meals didn't always arrive. The less extreme? Delays were common. Breakfast came at noon, dinner late at night. Inmates joked bitterly that they were on New York time. But the extreme struck when an entire block was skipped during lockdown. No trays. No food. For 24 hours, men pounded their doors, begging for something to eat. By morning, the sound was weaker, just fists tapping against steel, voices hoarse from hunger. The chapter ends with a guard finally sliding a tray under the door, one loaf, split between two men. ADX, liquid diet. ADX Florence had another method of control, liquid food. The less extreme? Prisoners on medical watch were given shakes, watery mixes of vitamins and calories. Some said it was tolerable, even better than the loaf. But the extreme? When men went on hunger strike, those same shakes were forced through tubes shoved into their noses. Gagging, choking, eyes watering, they had no choice. The chapter closes with the sound of gagged coughing, the tube dripping liquid down into the throat of a man too weak to resist. Pelican Bay, the chow hall silence. Meals at Pelican Bay were silent. Guards watched from towers, rifles trained on men eating below. The less extreme? Inmates sat still, heads down, shoving food quickly into their mouths. One wrong move could mean discipline. But silence bred tension. One day, a man laughed too loudly at a joke. Guards rushed in, slammed him to the ground, and dragged him out. His food was left overturned on the table, beans dripping onto the floor. The chapter ends with the other men staring at their trays, too afraid to move. Rikers, maggots on the tray. Rumors of contamination haunted Rikers for decades. The less extreme? Men joked about protein with legs, swearing they saw bugs in the oatmeal. Some picked them out and ate anyway. But then came the extreme. One inmate lifted his bread to find maggots crawling underneath. He screamed, threw the tray, and the entire hall erupted in chaos. Guards stormed in with batons while men flipped trays in protest. The chapter ends with the chow hall flooded in slop, the writhing maggots still crawling on the bread. The menu of madness. Food at ADX became a kind of madness. The less extreme? Inmates obsessed over old meals, describing burgers, steaks, and fries they'd eaten years ago. They recited recipes like prayers, clinging to memories. But the extreme? Some snapped. One man smeared ketchup packets on his face, screaming he was at a barbecue. Another hallucinated, claiming to smell Thanksgiving turkey in the air. The chapter ends with his screams echoing down the block, a guard muttering, the menus breaking them. Pelican Bay, the hunger duel. Hunger turned cellmates into enemies. The less extreme? Some men tried to share, splitting loaves or trading bites of food. For a while it worked. But the extreme came when two cellmates fought over a hidden stash of bread. The fight ended with one man beaten unconscious, his face bruised, the bread roll crushed in his hand. The chapter closes with guards dragging both men out, the bloodied bread left behind. Rikers, the protest meal. Food became protest at Rikers too. The less extreme? Inmates refused trays, sliding them back untouched to send a message. Guards logged it and moved on. But the extreme erupted when dozens of men staged a chow hall protest, banging trays, chanting for better food. Guards charged, pepper spray filled the room, and men fell choking onto the floor. The chapter ends with overturned trays everywhere, beans smeared on walls like graffiti. ADX, the tray slot. The slot in the steel door was the lifeline, and the curse. The less extreme? Meals slid in, trays clattering to the ground. Prisoners sometimes thanked guards just for the human contact. But the extreme? Some slammed their arms through the slot, refusing to let go until they were beaten back. Others hurled trays back out, splattering food down the hall. Guards responded with gas grenades. The chapter ends with a tray lying broken in the corridor, food smeared like war paint on the floor. Pelican Bay, the empty bowl. Prisoners waited for meals like clockwork. But sometimes the bowls came empty. The less extreme? Mistakes happened. Guards claimed the kitchen ran out. Men grumbled but waited for the next round. But the extreme? One night, a prisoner lifted his lid to find nothing inside. No beans, no rice, just an empty bowl. His screams echoed until others joined in, rattling their trays like drums. The chapter closes with guards storming in, dragging him out while the other inmates roared in protest. Rikers, moldy bread. Bread was life at Rikers, but not when it was rotten. The less extreme? Men picked the mold off and ate anyway. Hunger didn't give them choices. But one day, dozens of loaves came green and spotted. The men refused them, stacking the bread in piles like evidence. Guards shouted back, "Eat it or starve." The extreme came when one man forced it down, vomiting seconds later onto the chow hall floor. The chapter ends with piles of moldy bread abandoned, the stench filling the air. ADX, final control. At ADX, food wasn't food anymore. It was control in its purest form. The less extreme? Some prisoners still managed routines, eating slowly, savoring crumbs, stretching meals to pass the endless hours. But the extreme truth? The administration knew hunger weakened the body, and bland food broke the spirit. Loaf by loaf, tray by tray, men were reduced to shadows of themselves. The chapter ends with the sound of a tray slot closing one last time, echoing down the silent block. Pelican Bay, the stolen tray. Food scarcity bred theft. The less extreme? Hungry men snatched rolls or cartons of milk when guards weren't looking. Some laughed about it, calling it prison shoplifting. But the extreme hit when a tray was stolen right off another inmate's table. A fistfight exploded, metal trays crashing like shields, beans splattering across faces. Guards swarmed, locking both men in solitary, without meals for 24 hours. The chapter ends with an empty table, the stolen tray lying overturned on the floor. Rikers, kitchen chaos. Behind the bars, the kitchen was its own battlefield. The less extreme? Inmates working in the kitchen sometimes snuck scraps into their pockets. Extra bread, an apple, a packet of sugar. For them, it was survival. But then the extreme, a kitchen riot. Men clashed with ladles and pans, shouting over spoiled meat and rotten vegetables. One man was slashed with a makeshift knife, his blood spilling into a vat of soup. The chapter closes with guards storming in, dragging men across the floor while the soup pot boiled red. The last bite. Inside ADX, food could become obsession. The less extreme? Men saved scraps of bread, nibbling slowly, stretching one bite across an hour just to feel in control. But the extreme came when a prisoner snapped after another inmate snatched his last piece of bread through the bars. He pounded the wall until his fists bled, screaming for hours, his sanity unraveling over a crust of bread. The chapter ends with silence. The man slumped on the floor, staring at his bloody fists. Pelican Bay, watered down. Food wasn't the only tool, water was too. The less extreme? Inmates were given weak, watered-down drinks, barely flavored, barely satisfying. They gulped it down anyway, too thirsty to care. But the extreme? Rumors spread that guards diluted juice with chemicals to keep prisoners weak. Whether true or not, the men stopped drinking it, their bodies drying out in silent rebellion. The chapter ends with a row of untouched cups, liquid glowing under the harsh fluorescent lights. Broken by the menu. In Rikers, ADX, and Pelican Bay, food told the same story. It wasn't meant to nourish. It was meant to punish. The less extreme side? Inmates tried to resist, making spreads, trading commissary, laughing through hunger. They fought to keep humanity alive in every bite. But the extreme truth was undeniable. The menu broke men from the inside. It weakened their bodies, stole their dignity, and crushed their spirit without chains or fists. One inmate summed it up best. They don't have to beat you. They just feed you until you're no longer human. The chapter ends with the haunting image of an untouched tray, cold, gray, and silent, sitting in the middle of a concrete cell. The weapon on the tray. In the free world, food is comfort. It brings families together. It fuels hope. But inside Rikers, ADX, and Pelican Bay, food became something else. A weapon. Every loaf, every rotten piece of bread, every missing tray carried a message. We control you. And that's the final truth. These prisons weren't just about bars and steel doors. They were about breaking men with something as simple, as ordinary, as a tray of food. Because in the end, it wasn't fists or batons that did the most damage. It was the menu.